Let me wear your name, defend your silence, sleep beside your absence, and then you erased me. The lawyer's voice finishes the sentence on the page. No gasp follows, no movement. Ira sits still at the end of the table, hands folded, back straight. The room waits for her to fall apart. Cameras are ready. Board members glance at one another. Someone clears a throat. Nothing comes. The will keeps speaking. Pages turn. Numbers follow. Properties, accounts, control of everything her husband built. None of it goes to her. A name appears. One she has never signed. One she has never carried. A child she never gave birth to. A murmur breaks loose behind her. Ira does not turn. The lawyer pauses, eyes lifting toward her, cautious now. He expects a question. He expects denial. He expects noise. Ira lifts her chin. "I don't have a child," she says. Her voice stays level. Not cold. Controlled. The lawyer swallows. "That is correct, Mrs. Saints." The sentence lands heavier than any shout. Across the table, faces tighten. Someone shifts in their seat. This was meant to be a public ending. A woman exposed. A widow undone. Ira gives them none of it. Inside, something sharp settles. Not grief, not surprise, recognition. Her husband did not forget her. He chose to remove her. She stays seated as the reading continues, already understanding one truth. Mako Saints found a way to speak without her consent, and he made sure the world heard him. The reading ends. No one moves first. Black marble stretches under the boardroom table like a mirror no one wants to look into. A few blink too slowly. One woman leans back as if unsure whether to offer pity or stay silent. Another scribbles a note that's more about avoiding eye contact than needing to remember anything. Ira stays still. She doesn't fidget, doesn't flinch, doesn't touch the glass of water in front of her. A man across from her, the company's legal advisor, waits a few seconds longer. "Do you have questions, Mrs. Saints?" He says it gently, but the tension in his jaw betrays the effort. Ira looks at him, not past him, not through him, at him. "I heard everything." One sentence. No outrage. No breakdown. No request for clarity. It throws them off more than a scream would have. They expected noise, drama, headlines. She gives them control instead. The control Mako spent years trying to keep. When Ira stands, her chair doesn't scrape. She pushes it back with care. Her heels move without hurry, her steps measured and soft. No one stops her. No one follows. She leaves that boardroom, not as a grieving wife, not as a humiliated widow, but as someone they now fear slightly, because they cannot read her. Because silence in that moment became leadership. The elevator doors close behind her. Ira doesn't touch her phone. She doesn't speak to the assistant who rushes to match her stride in the hallway. She keeps walking. The glass walls of the Saints Group headquarters reflect her figure as she passes. Her own face looks back, composed, unreadable. People notice, not the way they used to, not because of her style or her posture, because she didn't break. Ira steps outside. New York traffic greets her like it always does, loud, busy, indifferent. But her pulse has changed. Inside her chest, where control used to sit like armor, something else grows. Not shock, not confusion, not even sadness. Anger. A clean, focused anger. Not because of wealth, not because of embarrassment, because she gave Mako her loyalty, and he answered it with erasure. She had stood beside him, while others lied for him. She never asked for more than respect. She thought silence had earned her peace, but silence had been mistaken for weakness. Ira opens the door to the waiting car. The driver doesn't ask questions. She doesn't offer directions. For now, she doesn't need answers. She needs the truth, and she's done waiting for it to come to her. She wore his name. She defended his image. She built a life inside his silence. And he left everything. To a child she never met. What would you do if your husband left his entire fortune to a child you never had? Ira's hand closes around the doorframe before entering the car. Still no tears. Still no panic. Only precision. She didn't break. She didn't scream. She just walked out. Because sometimes silence is louder than any courtroom. Drop a comment below if you believe silence can speak louder than betrayal. Like this video if you've ever had to protect your dignity when no one believed you'd stay calm. Your engagement helps more people find stories that matter. My billionaire husband left his entire fortune to a child I never had. The city stays loud behind tinted windows. Ira doesn't watch it. She sits in the back seat, eyes on nothing, thoughts circling only one fact: he planned this. Not in a rush, not by mistake. Piece by piece, Mako made decisions she was never meant to see. He wrote a will. He created a trust. He named a child. And he never once looked her in the eye to say her place in his life was conditional. The car turns into the private lane of the mansion, hers by title but not by memory. She walks inside. No one greets her. No sound travels beyond her heels crossing the polished floor. No framed photo holds their faces. She moves to the master bedroom, the one where she slept alone for years, where his side of the bed stayed smooth, untouched. Ira sits. She doesn't cry. She doesn't scream. She opens a drawer, pulls out an envelope. Blank, sealed. She doesn't open it yet, because now her story doesn't begin with loss. It begins with removal. And what a woman builds once she's no longer afraid of being replaced. The conference room on the 37th floor of Saints Group headquarters was designed for performance. Glossed walnut table, wall-length windows, a skyline backdrop meant to remind every guest of power. Today, it was full of spectators, lawyers, executives, extended family, a few familiar strangers who had always lingered around Mako Saint's orbit. At the head of the table sat Ira Saints, his wife, still in black, still wearing the ring. To her left, the family attorney, Walter Green, cleared his throat for the second time. "I'll begin," he said, although everyone knew he already had. Ira didn't interrupt. The will, read like a checklist. Assets, companies, bonds, properties in 3 countries, all of it, itemized, notarized, finalized. Each paragraph moved further down a road Ira expected to lead to her name. Until it didn't. No trust in her name. No transition clause. No message. When the final section arrived, Walter hesitated. Mako Saints leaves the entirety of his estate and holdings to one named beneficiary. His voice dropped half a key. Anthony Rowe. A pause. Then, for the first time, Ira blinked slowly. Not a twitch, not a startle. A still blink. Thoughtful. Precise. Whispers began immediately. "Who is that?" "I thought they had no children." "Did she know?" Ira's face remained still. Walter lifted his eyes. "To clarify, Mako Saints acknowledges Anthony Rowe as his biological son. Full rights of inheritance apply under state and federal law." Ira did not ask him to repeat it. Her fingers rested lightly on the table. No reach for a tissue. No lurch. No collapse. She received nothing, not even an explanation. The room froze. Anthony Rowe, not a business partner, not a cousin, not even a name Ira had encountered in passing. She turned her head slightly, only slightly, toward Walter Green. Her voice was calm. "Who is Anthony Rowe?" Walter's throat tightened before he responded. "He is the child of Mr. Saints, confirmed through court-validated paternity testing." Ira's hands stayed where they were. Her shoulders didn't shift, but her gaze sharpened. "How old?" Walter looked down. 8. Ira absorbed the number. 8 years. Her marriage to Mako had lasted 10. Another murmur filled the room, this one edged with discomfort. Executives who once praised Mako's strategic vision now pretended to study their folders. A family friend, someone who once toasted at their 5th anniversary gala, fiddled with her necklace. Ira didn't speak. She ran the math in her mind. Mako had been traveling often the first 2 years. He spent long weeks in Atlanta and Houston. She thought it was business. Now she wasn't so sure. Someone at the end of the table shifted awkwardly and asked, "Was the child known to the company?" Walter shook his head. "No, The will and all accompanying documents were kept in a private legal vault. Ira turned back to face forward. No tears, no gasps. But now the silence took shape. It wasn't blank anymore. It was full of lies, full of decisions made without her, full of a life built beside hers and hidden. Anthony Rowe. She had never heard the name, never saw a photo, never once suspected the man she'd shared a home with had a second life detailed so precisely. She was not only left out of the will, she had been written out of the story entirely. Walter finished reading. No one moved to speak next. A junior executive at the far end of the table glanced sideways, waiting for Ira to react. One of Mako's distant cousins leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to rush in and support her. Publicly, of course. But Ira didn't break. She leaned back against her chair. Her breath remained steady. No tight lips. No sudden gestures. No clenching of the jaw. The kind of stillness that unsettles people. The room started to shift. Not with empathy, with confusion. This woman was supposed to erupt. She was supposed to challenge the will, scream, protest, cry. She did none of that. She reached for her purse, calmly zipped it open, and placed a pen inside. Then closed it again. Walter tried. "Mrs. Saints, if you need time." "No," she said. Her tone wasn't harsh. It was full, measured, quiet, yet final. More heads turned now. A few guests whispered to their neighbors, but even their whispers were unsure. She stood. "Is there anything else?" she asked. Walter blinked. "There's a sealed letter addressed to the beneficiary, delivered already." Ira nodded once. "Then we're done." The act of her standing, composed and unreadable, did more damage than any outburst would have, because everyone in that room had imagined how she might fall apart. No one prepared for her to rise calmly and walk out untouched. Someone finally muttered, "She didn't know." Another voice answered, "But she's not reacting." Someone else murmured, "That's worse." Ira stepped into the hallway without a single word trailing behind her. The double glass doors eased shut. Inside the boardroom, voices finally began to move again. Outside, Ira walked, head upright, pace steady, no expression on her face. An assistant tried to match her steps. "Ma'am, would you like me to—" "No," Ira said. Not rushed, not impolite, clear. She pressed the elevator button once. Waited. Didn't check her phone. Didn't speak again. When the doors opened, a pair of interns stepped back instinctively. Not because she looked upset, because they couldn't tell what she looked like at all. She rode down alone. Floor by floor, she stood without flinching, as if the gravity in that elevator belonged to someone else. At the lobby, a security guard met her with a respectful nod. She returned it with a single blink. Nothing more. Her car was waiting. She slid in quietly, the door shutting behind her with a soft click. The city pressed itself against the window, but Ira didn't look outside. She was thinking, not about revenge, not about contesting, not even about Anthony Rowe. She was thinking about the man she married. How many rooms he sat in without ever mentioning her. How many meetings he walked into while she stood behind him, carrying his last name with grace. And without invitation, she could have broken down. Instead, she let silence speak. Not grief, not denial, not fear, just silence. The kind of silence that marks the start of a new story, not the end of an old one. The kind that unsettles, not because it's empty, but because it holds everything. Ira turned her head just once, to glance at the tower she left behind. She didn't blink twice, didn't linger. Only one line left her mouth, quiet but sharp. "I don't have a son," and with that, the car pulled into traffic, taking her not into confusion, but toward clarity. Ira didn't grow up desperate. She grew up surrounded by effort. Her parents were civil servants in Maryland. She learned early that survival wasn't about luck. It was about keeping your head down and choosing stability every time. By 28, Ira had a clean resume, 2 degrees, and a job in corporate ethics consulting. She'd sat across from more executives than she could remember. Most of them looked through her. Mako Saints didn't. He was calm, composed, impossible to read. When they first met during a third-party audit for the Saints Group, he barely spoke, yet somehow he noticed everything. He didn't flirt, he assessed. That's what made him dangerous and compelling. Their conversations were brief, sharp, clean. A few weeks later, Ira received a dinner invitation from one of Mako's aides. The restaurant was private. The offer that followed wasn't romantic. It was structured, detailed. Marriage. Mako's parents had expectations. Legacy mattered. Public image mattered. A partner who looked strong without inviting chaos, that mattered most of all. Ira listened. She didn't say yes because she needed saving. She said yes because she was tired of carrying everything alone. The deal came with space, resources, independence. What she didn't realize was that she'd be marrying a man who valued presence without intimacy. Mako didn't insult her. He didn't lie. He offered her position. And she accepted. Some people marry for love. Ira married for peace. At least, that's what she told herself. Their wedding was flawless by every external measure. Neutral tones, clean architecture, press coverage approved in advance. The guest list read like a merger agreement. Politicians, investors, legacy friends. Ira wore a dress chosen by Mako's mother, not out of pressure, out of efficiency. The photos made it to national magazines. Her expression? Elegant, composed. His? Polished, blank. They stood side by side, never touching, never leaning in. Their hands stayed to their sides. The only connection between them was the contract they both understood. Privately, the night was just as clinical. Mako didn't speak much after the ceremony. He thanked her. That was it. Not affection, not warmth. Gratitude, like she'd signed a document and delivered on time. The honeymoon never happened. He claimed travel demands, board obligations, and expansion meetings. Ira didn't protest. She unpacked alone. When the press asked later what it was like to marry such a powerful man, she always smiled softly and said, "He's focused." They believed her, because that was the brand. Behind closed doors, there were no fights, no shouting, no slammed doors, just quiet. A kind of cold that didn't hurt at first, until it became permanent. She started to understand that some forms of neglect leave no marks, but they still hollow you out. Still, Ira didn't complain. She played her part. She knew better than to expect what hadn't been offered. This wasn't love. It was function, and she performed it perfectly. By the second year, Ira stopped waiting for change. Mako traveled more. Europe, Asia, conferences, acquisitions, always moving, always somewhere that didn't include her. At home, silence became the norm. He didn't ask how her day went. He didn't offer questions. He gave updates, brief, to the point, as if managing an employee. At first, she tried. She set his favorite tea beside his study door at night. She left small notes on the kitchen counter, asking how the trip went. She suggested dinner. Just once a week. Nothing shifted. The tea stayed untouched. The notes went unanswered. The dinner suggestion was met with a light nod that never turned into action. Ira stopped trying. She began waking earlier than him, running through the garden before sunrise, reading with headphones in. She attended events alone and perfected the art of conversation without revealing anything personal. She filled her hours with structure, morning yoga, work consultations, charity board meetings, late-night journaling. In public, people admired her. She was graceful, intelligent, disciplined. In private, she learned how to exist beside someone who never once asked her what she hoped for. No shouting, no violence, just absence, a kind of distance that became easier to accept than to resist. She chose her wardrobe carefully, not to attract, but to remind herself she was still visible, even when unseen. She wasn't suffering. She was adjusting. It was the only way to stay sane. She'd made peace with being a placeholder, a respectable image for a man who didn't believe in closeness. And because she didn't complain, no one ever asked if she was okay. Mako never accused her of anything. He never raised suspicion aloud. He simply behaved like trust was too expensive to offer. Every financial report was reviewed twice, once by his team, once by him. Every conversation involving the Saints Group's future excluded her. When reporters asked about their household, he spoke only about the company. Ira started to notice patterns. Documents were locked. Certain doors in the mansion, his office, his private safe room, were always shut. Passwords changed often, though she never asked for them. Once, she overheard a quiet exchange between Mako and his assistant. "Send a revised estate file," he'd said. Ira had entered the room seconds later. He didn't flinch. He simply closed the screen and moved on. She didn't ask. She didn't confront, not because she was afraid, because she understood. If a man has already decided you're convenient but unworthy of truth, asking him why only deepens the humiliation. He believed she married him for the lifestyle. He never said it, but she heard it in how he watched her, measured, cautious, distant. To him, Ira was a good investment, educated, polished, predictable, but never quite safe. He kept her beside him, like you keep a high-end watch in public, displayed, admired, but rarely trusted to speak for itself. And over time, she stopped expecting him to change his mind. Ira didn't chase proof. She didn't beg for clarity. She preserved her dignity by staying silent in the face of quiet dismissal. Mako had built an empire on control. He thought love was vulnerability, and he avoided both, even in marriage. The mansion was quiet the evening Ira returned from the will reading. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She walked through the hallway like she was moving through someone else's memory, not hers, never hers. She changed into flats, pulled her hair back, sat at her desk, not the one Mako used but her own, across the hall from his locked office. She opened her laptop and requested 3 things from Walter Green before midnight. The notarized copy of the will, the estate planning documentation from the past 10 years, the legal record validating Anthony Rowe's identity. She received all 3 by morning. Ira didn't call a reporter. She didn't alert the board. She didn't even phone a friend. She read every page, every signature, every clause written to leave her out. There were no errors, no loopholes, no missing details. The estate had been rerouted quietly, legally, and early, long before Mako collapsed on that overseas board retreat. She found the date on the trust deed, 4 years ago, which meant, while she was still attending fundraisers as his wife, while she was still being presented as the calm backbone of his legacy, he had already built an exit that didn't include her. Ira didn't shake. She took notes. Every number, every legal witness, every revision to his previous plan. Then she pulled out her planner, the one Mako never noticed she updated weekly, and started organizing her own strategy. She wouldn't fight blindly. She would know everything first. Ira Saints had been erased in public, but in private she was preparing for the one battle Mako never saw coming, the truth. The folder labeled Supplemental Estate Files held the rest. Ira flipped through legal language with the steadiness of someone trained to spot detail. That skill had earned her respect in boardrooms. Now, it confirmed her displacement. Page 12. Line 6. Anthony Rowe, biological son of Mako Saints. Date of birth, September 18th, 8 years prior. Paternity verified, certified DNA analysis included. She stared at the attached lab document. Clean, conclusive, undeniable. There was no legal contest to be made. Mako had planned for that. Next, guardianship, assigned to Niall Carter. Black American, early 30s. No spouse listed. Profession noted, private home caregiver. Ira exhaled once, not from emotion, from calculation. No mention of co-parenting. No acknowledgement in public records. Niall had remained invisible. Ira searched her name through court filings, public records, tax liens, nothing that hinted at scandal, manipulation, or greed. Just a modest woman, with a modest income, and one major secret under legal seal. She looked again at the signature Mako had used on the guardianship agreement. Same as always. Sharp, clean, efficient. He had been deliberate in everything, including who got to raise his only child. Ira leaned back in her chair, surrounded by proof of a life she'd never been given access to. He hadn't just hidden a child, he'd hidden the decisions, the love, the responsibility, and most importantly, the truth that would have explained the hollow marriage he'd left her, trapped in for years. This wasn't about money, it was about narrative. Mako had rewritten their story, and she'd only received the final page after his death. Ira closed the file. She still hadn't cried. She didn't plan to, not yet. Ira didn't go back to the boardroom. She didn't attend the meetings that followed. She didn't entertain calls or answer her emails. The mansion was still, the housekeepers silent, their footsteps too careful to interrupt her space. She moved through the rooms with nothing but the sound of her own breath until she reached the master bedroom. Her bedroom. She'd spent years here, in silence, years in a bed that hadn't felt like hers, beneath a roof she wasn't allowed to question. Mako's side was always empty, the sheets smooth and untouched. A part of her had tried to ignore it, to convince herself that what was unsaid was acceptable. She had accepted it. Until now. She closed the door softly behind her. She didn't look at the bed first. She looked at the window, across the room, out toward the skyline. Mako's world, the one he had never fully shared. She moved to the dresser where his things had once been. Collected watches, expensive ties, leather gloves. He never had a second thought about leaving his life scattered. It was a space meant for someone who didn't care about their own departure. Ira found herself staring at the empty spaces, where his cologne bottle had stood, where his cufflinks had been placed carefully, the same spaces that had defined her marriage. It wasn't about money. She hadn't fought for any inheritance or possession. It was about control. It was about a man who had decided that she never needed to know the truth. Ira hadn't been erased because of wealth. She had been erased because he feared her knowing the story of his life that he could never share. Her chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Not grief. Not rage. It was realization. She had spent too many years of her life questioning herself when the answers had been hidden from her all along. No amount of wealth could replace the loss of truth, and she was done being kept in the dark. She finally turned to the bed. The empty space beside her felt heavier now, like the weight of years spent waiting for him to show her a life they could have shared. But he had built walls so high she couldn't see over them. Ira didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply took a deep breath. And for the first time, she closed her eyes and accepted that she was free to choose what came next. The next morning, Ira woke up before dawn. She didn't linger in bed. She didn't contemplate the past. The decision had already been made. She dressed quickly, choosing a simple grey suit that would blend in with any corporate setting but still hold an edge of professionalism. The choice of a muted colour wasn't accidental. It was her way of keeping the chaos at bay. The last thing she needed was to give anyone a glimpse into the thoughts churning beneath the surface. She moved through the house, the rooms still empty, and walked toward the study. It was the first time in a long while she felt like she was taking control of something. Ira knew the documents inside Mako's locked office would be critical, but she also knew that confronting the truth in a public way, fighting the will, demanding the fortune, wouldn't bring the answers she needed. She wasn't after what Mako had left behind. She was after the truth about what had been kept from her. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. A lawyer who specialized in estate cases and discreet investigations. A man who understood the importance of quiet, calculated action. "Good morning, Ira," he said when he picked up, his voice calm, unflustered. "I assume you're calling for the papers?" "Yes," Ira replied, her tone firm. "I need the full background on Niall Carter. I want to know everything, every document, every connection, every piece of information she's had access to regarding Mako's estate and guardianship of Anthony Rowe." The lawyer hesitated, then said, "I'll have it to you in 24 hours. "I'll be waiting," Ira said, ending the call. She placed the phone on the desk, her thoughts moving to Niel, the woman who had raised Mako's son, the woman who had been hidden in plain sight. But Niel wasn't her target. Niel wasn't the enemy. The truth was, it wasn't about fighting for what was left. It was about fighting for the clarity that had been stolen from her. Ira had never been a fighter by nature. She was controlled, composed, always the partner in the background, never in the spotlight. But now, that composure would become her weapon. Her silence would be her strength. Mako never thought she would see the truth of what he'd done. He never thought she would dig past the surface, past the polite silence. Ira hadn't needed to fight for what he left her. What she needed, what she was taking, was control of the truth. And she would find it, no matter the cost. Ira didn't approach Niel directly. That wasn't her method. Instead, she chose patience, the kind that comes with understanding the value of time. Niel Carter's life had been lived quietly under the radar. No press, no whispers. She hadn't demanded attention. She didn't need it. But she had a connection to Mako, and that connection meant something now, something Ira was ready to uncover. She began her investigation methodically. No flashy lawyers, no phone calls to old friends who might pry. Instead, Ira turned to the slow-moving public records, driver's licenses, tax returns, a single real estate transaction that linked Niel to a modest apartment, a name on a school registration form for a boy, Tony. The more she dug, the more she learned how carefully Mako had guarded his secrets. Niel had been hidden in plain sight, not because of shame, but because of control. She didn't reach for a newspaper. She didn't check gossip columns. She simply watched. She followed Niel's public footprint, her movements around the city, her shopping habits, the places she frequented. Ira made no attempt to be seen. She was a shadow, always observing, always aware. There were no signs of financial instability. Niel had managed to keep herself under the radar, living modestly, almost invisibly. But Ira knew this was far from the full picture. Mako's secrets ran deeper than she realized. And Tony Rowe, his very existence was a piece of that secret. A secret Ira hadn't even known existed until now. Ira had never been one for overt observation. Her presence was always reserved, unnoticed. But now, as she watched Tony, she saw more than just a child. One sunny afternoon, Ira took a seat in a park across from a small playground. She wasn't there for relaxation, but for the boy, for Tony. He was with a security guard, Mako's old employee. She recognized him. The guard tossed a soccer ball to Tony, who kicked it back with precision. The movements were calculated, careful, too careful for a child his age. There was something in the way he carried himself, so unlike most kids. No wild laughter, no uncontained joy. He seemed grounded, too grounded for someone so young. Ira leaned forward slightly, watching him with new intensity. His posture was rigid, like Mako's, distant, controlled. When he smiled, it wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate, measured, like he was practicing a version of happiness. Mako had always been composed, never rushed, never loud. Now, in Tony, Ira saw echoes of that same restraint. His movements, his mannerisms, they weren't born out of innocence, but out of something more calculated. Ira's heart tightened. This child was a reflection of Mako's decisions. But more than that, he was the result of a life she had never been given access to. He wasn't just Mako's son. He was the proof of all the years Ira had spent by his side, believing in something that had never truly existed. She didn't know how to feel about Tony. He wasn't her son, but he was a product of her silence, of her erasure, and that stung more than she had expected. Ira's visits to the park became a routine. She wasn't there for Tony, at least not solely. She was there to understand how a child could grow without ever knowing the truth about his father's other life. A life hidden, guarded, kept away from her at every turn. But one afternoon, as Ira sat on a bench observing Tony play with the guard, she felt a sudden, unsettling shift in the air. Niel appeared. She had been watching too, silent, calculating. Niel didn't approach immediately. She stood across the park, arms crossed, studying Ira with an intensity that wasn't unfamiliar. It was the kind of gaze that measured a person's every move, anticipating what they would do next. Ira knew the moment Niall saw her. She knew that for all the calmness that had colored their interactions before, this was something else. This was a boundary, a line that Niall was unwilling to let Ira cross. Ira stood slowly, gathering her composure. She'd already made the decision. She wasn't here for Tony, not in the way Niall would think. She wasn't here to challenge the child, to replace him. When their eyes met, Ira's voice was calm. "I'm not here for him. I'm here for the truth." Niall's posture shifted instantly. The guard stopped passing the ball. Tony stood still, looking back at Niall, as if sensing the tension. Niall's face tightened. "You think you have the right to the truth?" Niall asked, her voice firm, low, but laced with an edge Ira hadn't expected. "I don't have the right to anything," Ira replied, "but I will find the truth." Niall's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, Ira could see the anger flicker just beneath the surface of her composed exterior. "This isn't something you're entitled to," Niall said, stepping toward her. "This has nothing to do with you." But it did. It always had. Ira didn't step back. "You think you know what this is about, but you don't. This isn't about him. It's about the lies Mako left behind." Niall took a breath, and Ira knew she was done with this conversation. But there was something in the way Niall had spoken, something defensive, something desperate. "I'm not here to fight you," Ira added, her tone softening. "I just need to know everything." Niall's eyes flickered with uncertainty, then quickly hardened. Without another word, she turned and walked toward Tony. Her back was straight, her pace swift. The door to the truth seemed locked, and Niall held the key. But Ira had never been afraid of locked doors. Ira watched Niall take Tony's hand and guide him away from the park. The boy didn't look back, his attention caught by something else, something that had always been more important than her presence in the world Mako had created. As Ira stood alone on the edge of the park, the weight of what she had just learned pressed in. She wasn't a part of Tony's world. She had never been invited into it. And the truth, no matter how many times she demanded it, was just beyond her reach. She had no right to the boy, no claim over him. She knew that. But still, the thought gnawed at her. Tony was Mako's son, yes. But to Ira, he represented something far more personal. He wasn't just a child she had never known. He was the embodiment of what she had always feared, that, in the end, she had been expendable. Ira had never asked to be part of a life filled with silence. She had never asked to be someone's placeholder, a figure to be admired but never truly known. But now, it all made sense. Mako had chosen everything but her. Even after all the years they spent together, he had chosen a secret life over her presence. She had been erased from it. And, the cruelest part, he had replaced her existence with a child he kept hidden. "He replaced my existence," Ira whispered to herself as she stood there, still in the fading light of the afternoon. Her words felt strange, heavy, as though saying them out loud had made them more real. The silence she had lived with for so long, the silence that had become her defense, her shield, suddenly felt like a prison. It wasn't the child's fault. It wasn't even Niall's fault. But Mako had replaced her. He had taken everything she had been, the wife, the partner, and rewritten their story without her even knowing it. Ira didn't feel anger in that moment. She didn't feel rage. She simply felt something more profound, the aching realization that all those years, all that silence, had only made her invisible. The hardest truth to accept wasn't the wealth Mako had left behind. It wasn't the child. It was the quiet understanding that in the end, Ira Saints had been a ghost in the life she thought she shared with him. Ira didn't expect Niall to agree to speak with her. But when she called, there was a shift in the air. Niall had been guarded, defensive, but now her tone had softened and the meeting was set. Ira didn't push. She simply agreed to the time and place. The quiet cafe on the edge of the city, unassuming, with no prying eyes. When Ira walked in, she spotted Niall right away. She was sitting at the corner table, her hands folded in front of her, looking more composed than she'd expected. But there was something in her eyes, something that Ira hadn't seen in their brief encounters before. It was a blend of weariness and caution, as if she knew this conversation would cross boundaries neither of them could undo. Ira took a seat across from her. Neither woman spoke for a long moment. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a silence that lingered, waiting. Niel finally exhaled. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Mako left everything for Tony. He was never meant to replace you." Ira leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "I'm not here to fight Tony," she said. "I'm here to understand the truth, the full truth, not just what Mako left behind." Niel's eyes flickered, just for a second, before she nodded slowly. "That's the part no one talks about." And with that, the walls began to lower. Niel looked down at her coffee for a moment, then back at Ira. Mako's world hadn't been as clean as Ira had thought. It wasn't just about financial dealings and legacy. It was about control, about keeping people in the dark, keeping them in their place. For the first time, Ira began to see the woman behind the name, behind the quiet walls Niel had built around herself. Niel's gaze softened as she spoke again. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't speaking for approval. She was simply telling the truth, the one she had kept hidden for years. "It started before you, Ira," Niel began, her voice almost reluctant to begin, but steady as she continued. "Mako and I were never in love, not the way people think, not like you might have imagined when you saw him. Strong, composed, always in control." Ira remained silent, watching Niel closely, waiting for her to go on. She knew this wasn't going to be easy to hear, but she needed to understand it. "We met long before you did," Niel continued. "It wasn't a whirlwind or a mistake. It was a connection. A brief, powerful thing. We weren't planning anything. He wasn't ready to settle down. And I wasn't looking for a relationship. It was simple." Her words were measured, as if she were still processing them herself. "But when I found out I was pregnant, things changed. For him, at least." Ira blinked slowly, absorbing the information. The timeline was clear. Niel shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of her own admission. "He wasn't thrilled, not at first, but we figured it out. Well, I did. He sent money. He supported me quietly, kept his distance. He was always focused on his work, his image." She paused, her lips tightening. "But he wasn't ready to have a child with me, not in the way I thought he would be." Ira leaned back slightly. She could feel the tension building in her chest, a mixture of sorrow and understanding. Mako had never been truly ready. He had avoided the very thing that had bound him to Niel, the same thing he had tried to erase from his life altogether. "But he never fully left," Niel added, her voice quiet but certain. "He made sure I had everything, even if he wasn't there. I think he thought he could keep us both in separate boxes. You and me. His life was always so clean, so controlled." Ira didn't speak for a long moment. She felt the weight of Mako's choices settling between them. He hadn't loved Niel. He hadn't loved her either. He had just chosen control over connection. But the child, Tony, was the one thing he couldn't hide. Niel's eyes darkened slightly as she continued. "Mako never hid Tony because of shame. He didn't love me, but he respected me enough to provide. No, he hid Tony because he didn't want anyone to know the truth." Ira stayed silent, processing her words. "Truth?" she repeated. Niel nodded, a flicker of bitterness passing across her face. Mako didn't want anyone to see the cracks in his life, the story he built. He was too busy maintaining his image, making sure everyone saw the perfect CEO, the perfect public figure. He didn't want Tony to interfere with that. Not then. Not ever. Ira's mind reeled. It wasn't about the child. It was about what Tony represented. A weakness Mako couldn't afford to acknowledge. A flaw that had never been part of the polished version of himself he wanted the world to see. "Mako didn't care for the past," Niel continued, her voice low but filled with clarity. "He cared about control. And keeping us, me and Tony, away from his perfect world was part of it. He needed to control the narrative. If anyone knew about Tony, his carefully crafted world would have fallen apart." Ira felt the sting of her own marriage come to the surface. She had been a part of that world, controlled, compartmentalized, never fully invited in. But now she realized that her silence had been part of Mako's manipulation. He had used it to keep his life in order, to shape his world into something acceptable for others. "You were the image, Aira," Niel went on, her gaze steady. "He kept you in the front row, perfect and poised. You represented his future, his power. But the truth, the real truth, was me, the past he couldn't bury. And Tony, he was the guilt, the child he couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried." The final words hit Aira like a wave. The guilt. Mako hadn't discarded her for another woman. He had discarded her because he feared what she would uncover, the secret life that had existed beside his public facade. The room around them seemed to shrink. Aira didn't know what to say. Mako had never given her the space to understand the depth of his control. And now it was clear, he had kept everything hidden because of his fear of exposure. Niel's eyes softened slightly, but the weight of her truth hung heavy between them. He couldn't allow himself to love us, Aira. Not truly. He loved his control more. Aira didn't speak right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what had been said. Her mind churned through the pieces Niel had offered, trying to arrange them in a way that made sense, trying to fit herself into the narrative that Mako had built without her. "You were never meant to be a part of the past, Aira," Niel said, her voice quieter now. "You were the future, the perfect wife, the one who could be molded to fit the story he wanted to tell. But the past, the real past, was me. It was Tony." The words stung, but Aira didn't flinch. She had long suspected that Mako hadn't truly loved her in the way she had wanted. But hearing it from Niel, the woman who had lived the part of his life that he'd kept hidden, was a different kind of revelation. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't a wife in the full sense. She had been a figure, an accessory to the public story. She had been the polished version of Mako's life, the one that was easy for people to admire, to respect, to look up to. But she hadn't been enough. Niel's face was soft now, almost sad, as she leaned forward. "Tony was never meant to replace you, Aira. He wasn't even meant to be seen." But Mako couldn't shake the guilt. He couldn't erase Tony from his life, no matter how much he tried. Aira felt her chest tighten. The pieces were clicking into place. "He never loved me," she said, the words tasting bitter but true. "He never trusted me enough to love me. He kept me beside him because I fit the image. I was the perfect public wife, but he never let me in." Niel nodded. "Exactly. He needed you, for power, for appearance, for the future of Saints Group. But he didn't need me, not the way I needed him. He kept me quiet, kept Tony hidden." Aira swallowed hard, her voice tight. "I was never part of his real life, was I?" Niel shook her head gently. "No, you weren't. You were the image he created, a wife, a companion. But the truth, it was always me and Tony. The past he tried to erase." For a moment, Aira sat in stunned silence, processing what Niel had said. Mako had never been her partner. He had never loved her the way she had loved him. He had used her to keep up an image, a lie, while the truth, his truth, had been quietly hidden away with Niel and Tony. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable now. It was full of understanding. Aira had never wanted to be the woman who was just an accessory to a man's image. She had wanted to be seen, to be valued. And now she realized that Mako had kept her invisible in ways she hadn't fully understood until this moment. Aira never expected to spend time with Tony. But it happened, quietly, unplanned. It was the kind of situation that could have been awkward, filled with words they didn't know how to say to each other. But instead, it unfolded with an ease that surprised both of them. It started on a Saturday afternoon, weeks after the first tense encounter in the park. Niel had been working, and Tony had finished his soccer practice early. Aira had been sitting on a bench reading a book in the park when she noticed him again. This time, he approached her first. "Are you Mrs. Saints?" he asked, his voice unsure but polite. Aira looked up, meeting his serious eyes. She smiled faintly. "That's me," she said gently. "But you can call me Aira." Tony nodded, sitting down beside her. They didn't talk immediately. He just sat there, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the ground in front of them. It was as though he didn't know how to begin. Ira didn't rush him. She had learned patience. She simply waited, the air between them filled with the unspoken understanding that neither of them had to force anything. It was Tony who finally broke the silence, his voice low. "Do you miss him?" Ira blinked. She didn't need to ask who he meant. "I miss the man I thought I knew," she said softly. "The one who was there, you know. But I didn't really know him." Tony nodded, like he understood. They sat in silence for a while longer. There was no need to rush words or explanations. Ira didn't need to take on the role of Tony's mother. She didn't need to fill the gaps in his life that Mako had left. But she was still there, and for some reason that seemed to be enough. Over the following weeks, Tony started to open up in small ways. His visits were brief, but each time he came by, his curiosity about Mako grew, and with it, his questions. One afternoon, Ira was sitting in the living room, flipping through some old photos when Tony entered, hesitating at the doorway. His eyes were wide, serious, almost too old for a boy his age. "Can I ask you something?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Ira looked up from the photo album. She saw the hesitation in his face and nodded gently. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Tony stepped closer, biting his lip, unsure. He wasn't a typical child asking about toys or games. Instead, his curiosity was layered with something deeper. "Did my dad love you?" The question hung in the air for a moment. It wasn't what Ira had expected, but it wasn't out of place. She took a deep breath, trying to gather the right words. "He respected me," she replied, her voice steady. "But he was afraid of closeness. He thought keeping his distance would keep him safe." Tony nodded again, processing the information. There was no judgment, no anger, just a quiet understanding that Ira could see in his eyes. He didn't ask for more, but she could tell that the answer had made some sense to him. "He never really let anyone close, did he?" Tony said softly, more to himself than to her. Ira's heart tightened at his words, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let the silence speak for itself. "He was afraid," she finally said. "Afraid that if he let anyone in, it would weaken him." She paused, looking at Tony with newfound clarity. But in doing that, he lost what really mattered. And it wasn't until the end that he realized that. Tony didn't reply. He just stood there for a moment, his small hands clenched by his sides. His gaze lingered on Ira, as if trying to piece together the fragmented story of his father's life that had never been told to him. Ira smiled gently. "You don't have to carry the weight of the past, Tony. You get to choose your own story." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something more, something that felt like the beginning of connection. The days that followed weren't dramatic. There were no heart-to-heart talks or grand gestures. But in the simplicity of their interactions, Ira and Tony started to build something new. Quietly, slowly. With each visit, Ira found herself learning about Tony, not as Mako's son, not as the child who had been kept in the shadows, but as a boy who was finding his own way through a confusing world. One afternoon, as Ira prepared tea in the kitchen, Tony wandered in, dragging his sneakers on the tiled floor. He didn't ask for anything, just stood there, watching her. She paused and smiled at him. "What's on your mind, Tony?" He shrugged. "Just nothing." But his eyes lingered on the way she moved, focused, precise, and Ira could see him taking it all in. A few moments passed, and then, almost unexpectedly, Tony spoke. "You're not like him." Ira stopped what she was doing. "What do you mean?" "You don't act like Mako did," Tony clarified, his words unsure but genuine. "He was always distant, but you just feel different." Ira paused, considering his words. She set the kettle down and walked over to him, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I don't want to be like him, Tony," she said softly. "I never did." Tony didn't look away. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, processing her honesty. For the first time, Ira saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes, a quiet acceptance that hadn't been there before. "I think," Tony started, his voice a little hesitant. "I think I'm starting to understand him. A little." He looked down at his shoes, still unsure of himself. Ira smiled, a mix of sadness and warmth crossing her face. She didn't push him further. She didn't need to. He was already beginning to process the truth of his father's choices, of the void Mako had left in his attempt to control everything, including his son's life. "Take your time," she said gently. "You don't have to understand everything all at once." Tony nodded slowly, then, after a beat, added, I kind of like being here, with you." Ira's heart swelled. She had never expected this. Not from the child who had been kept at arm's length from everything, but here he was, slowly letting her in, bit by bit. And for the first time, she realized that despite everything that had happened, despite the years of silence, the years of being erased, she was no longer alone in this. They were building something together, quietly, slowly, but it was real. As the weeks went by, Ira found herself spending more time with Tony, but it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her too. The more she shared space with him, the more she realized how much of her life had been built on the foundation of Mako's shadows. She had spent so many years defining herself by a marriage that never fully allowed her to be herself, by the role of wife that Mako had created for her, a position that was useful but ultimately empty. Now, as she sat with Tony, watching him grow in his own way, Ira felt a shift. She no longer felt like she was waiting for permission to exist. She had spent so much of her life performing for someone else's vision of what a marriage should be that she had forgotten how to live for herself. The quiet, unspoken connection between her and Tony was teaching her something Mako never had, the ability to simply be. One evening, after another long day of quiet talks and moments shared in silence, Ira went into the living room, where a few old photographs of Mako and her still hung on the walls. She studied them for a moment, then turned away. She didn't need them anymore. Her journey was hers now, no longer defined by Mako's expectations or her role in the house he built. She realized that all those years of trying to live up to an image she never created had drained her. But now, with Tony, she was building something new, something for herself. She no longer measured her worth against the empty spaces Mako had left behind. The house, the money, the public life, it didn't matter the way it once did. And Tony wasn't a replacement for her past. He was his own person, a reflection of both Mako and Niel, but also a child who had the chance to define his own future. Ira smiled softly, the weight of the past starting to lift. She wasn't the woman Mako had molded her into. She was her own woman, someone capable of choosing a path outside the shadows, outside the boundaries he had placed around her. It had taken time, but she was finally free to embrace it. The phone call came as expected, but Ira wasn't surprised. She had anticipated the legal ramifications of Mako's will, the demand for a battle over what was rightfully hers. The lawyer, on the other end of the line, spoke with practiced urgency, his voice smooth but tinged with the expectation of action. "Mrs. Saints, we've reviewed the will, and there is a clear pathway to contest it. The child was kept hidden for years. His sudden inclusion could be questioned. You have grounds for a challenge." Ira sat in her study, staring out the window at the city below. She didn't immediately respond. The voice on the other end of the line continued, detailing the potential claims, the loopholes, and the arguments they could make. The case was strong, or so they said, but Ira wasn't listening to the details. She wasn't focusing on the legal strategy. She was thinking about something far more profound, the cost of a battle she didn't want to fight. "Do I really need to go down that road?" she asked finally, her voice calm but resolute. "Is this really what I want?" There was a pause on the other end, as if the lawyer wasn't prepared for the question. "Mrs. Saints, it's about securing your financial future, your rights, your share of the estate." Ira exhaled slowly. She had been prepared for this moment, for the moment when someone would suggest that she take action to claim what was rightfully hers. But that wasn't the reason she had been silent for so long. "I don't need money to be whole again," she replied softly. "I don't need to fight for something that never felt real to me. I'm not going to fight him through his son." The lawyer seemed to hesitate. "But you've been wronged, Ira. This isn't about him. It's about you, about what you deserve." Ira stood, walking over to the shelf where old family photos rested. She picked up a picture of her and Mako from their early years of marriage. It felt distant now, like a life she had never truly lived. "I've spent enough years fighting for something I didn't want," she said quietly. "I won't fight for a past that doesn't belong to me." With that, she hung up the phone. There would be no contest, no courtroom drama, no battle over the will. Her fight wasn't with Tony or Niel. Her fight was with the ghost of the man who had never truly seen her. And she had already won that battle by choosing to walk away from the life he had tried to build for her. The decision was final. Ira wasn't going to contest Mako's will. She wasn't going to fight for money that had never truly been hers. The mansion, the power, the control. It was all part of a life that had never belonged to her heart. For the first time in years, Ira felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't freedom from loss. It was freedom from the need to prove her worth to anyone, even Mako. The emptiness she had felt in their marriage wasn't the absence of wealth, but the absence of truth. Mako had built a world around her, a world where she was expected to be a perfect wife, a perfect image. But he had never given her the truth, the one thing that could have connected them beyond appearances. Now, Ira realized something. She didn't need to fight for what had never been real. She didn't need to reclaim what wasn't truly hers. What mattered was that she could finally stand on her own, free from the emotional shackles of a past that wasn't built for her. She wasn't angry at Mako. She wasn't angry at Niel or Tony. They had their own truths, their own wounds. But Ira was no longer going to define her life by what others had done to her. She wasn't going to chase a life that wasn't meant for her, and she wasn't going to let the past hold her hostage any longer. Ira stood in front of the large window in her apartment, looking out at the city below. The world felt bigger now, less confined to the walls of the mansion Mako had left behind. Her life had always been about waiting for something to change, for someone else to give her the validation she had always sought. But now, she realized that she had the power to define her own future. The weight of being Mako's wife, of living in the shadow of his control, had been lifted. It wasn't about the mansion. It wasn't about the fortune. It was about her, her choices, her freedom. As she stood there, Ira felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She wasn't going to fight anymore. The only battle worth fighting was the one to reclaim herself. And for the first time, she was winning that one. Ira didn't immediately dive into any new ventures or relationships. She didn't rush to fill the space that Mako's absence had created. Instead, she spent time in reflection, quiet moments that allowed her to reconnect with herself. She sold the mansion. The decision was simple once she made it. The house was a symbol of everything she had tried to build on someone else's terms, and she was done pretending it was still hers. The sale wasn't just a financial transaction. It was symbolic. It marked the end of a chapter, the one where she was merely a placeholder in someone else's narrative. Ira moved into a smaller apartment. It wasn't grand or ostentatious. It was simple. It was hers. The walls were bare at first, but over time she began to fill them with art, with memories of her own choosing. The books she had always loved, the photographs of places she had traveled, moments she had shared with friends, and quiet moments she had found joy in on her own. She signed up for writing classes. Her love of storytelling had always been something she pushed to the back of her mind, but now she allowed herself to explore it, to put her thoughts down on paper. She began to write not for approval, but for herself. Stories that weren't about a perfect marriage or a perfect life, just real, raw truths that came from within. She started volunteering at a local organization, helping women who had faced difficult circumstances. She understood, more than most, how it felt to live under the weight of someone else's expectations, and she wanted to help others find their own strength. And in her spare time, she spent more days with Tony. But this time, she didn't come with the weight of expectation or the need to find answers. She just let him be a child, someone who had his own story to tell, his own wounds to heal. And she didn't try to fix them for him. She simply allowed space for him to grow in his own time. Ira wasn't rushing anymore. She had stopped defining herself by the roles Mako had tried to impose on her. She was no longer his wife, his image. She was Ira, and that was enough. A few months passed before Ira truly felt the shift. She no longer woke up to an empty house feeling like something was missing. Instead, she woke to a quiet peace, a sense of wholeness that came from within, not from external validation. She had spent years seeking approval, from Mako, from the world, from the life she thought she was supposed to have. Now, for the first time, Ira knew she didn't need any of it. She found comfort in small moments. A cup of tea in the morning before work, the quiet hum of the city at night as she read or wrote. She had reclaimed her autonomy, her space, and her choices. And for the first time, it felt like the world was truly hers to navigate. The absence of Mako's presence, once an ache she couldn't escape, had begun to fade. She didn't feel anger toward him anymore. There was nothing left for her to fight or to prove. He was a chapter in her past, but he no longer defined the narrative of her life. She started to date again, but in a way that felt authentic. No expectations, no pressure, just genuine connections, without the rush to make them fit into someone else's idea of what a relationship should look like. She was learning to love herself first, without needing anyone else to validate that love. And most importantly, she had built a life that was free from the constraints of Mako's control. No longer was she the quiet wife standing beside her husband's shadow. She was Ira, the woman who had chosen her own path, and whose choices were hers alone to make. The journey had been long and painful, but Ira was finally at peace with it. She had reclaimed herself. The future was hers, free from the ghosts of her past. And for the first time in her life, Ira felt the freedom to be who she was always meant to be. Ira had been sorting through the remnants of Mako's files for days, sifting through legal documents, old contracts, and personal notes that hadn't been touched in years. The mansion had been cleared out, the estate officially transferred. But there was one last task she had to complete, one final thread she needed to pull before she could truly let go. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But there was something she still needed to understand. Something that had been left behind, tucked away in the farthest corner of Mako's study. The last pieces of a life she'd been shut out of. The last remnants of the man who had once been everything to her. As she flipped through the stack of documents, something caught her eye. A letter, sealed with Mako's signature in an envelope so old the edges had turned brittle. It wasn't filed with the rest of his estate papers, nor was it labeled as part of his legal documentation. It was something else. Personal. Her hand trembled as she carefully broke the seal, the thin paper crackling under her fingertips. She knew what it was the moment she saw the handwriting. It was his letter, the one he had never sent. Ira held her breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She didn't want to read it. She didn't need to. But something inside her told her that this letter was more important than all the others, more important than the inheritance, more important than the money or the lies. With a steady hand, she unfolded it. The letter was short, and the handwriting trembled slightly near the edges, as though Mako had written it in one of his rare moments of emotional clarity. Ira read the first few lines slowly, the words feeling heavier with each sentence. Ira, I know I'll never be able to say this in person, but I need to try. I've spent so many years hiding behind the things I could control, my work, my public life, the walls I built around us, but I can't control this. I owe you the truth. His words hit her like a wave. The distance between them had never been clearer. Ira paused, pressing the letter against her chest for a moment, trying to process the sheer weight of it. I owe you the truth. Mako had never owed her anything. He had given her nothing but silence and space, yet here he was, speaking from the grave with words that carried the weight of every unspoken accusation. She continued reading. I was afraid of letting anyone close enough to see me for who I really am. I thought that if I let you in, if I allowed myself to be seen, it would make me weak. I thought love would make me vulnerable. Ira's hands shook slightly as she read on. The words were sharp, biting, as though he was confessing something that had burdened him for years. I kept you at a distance because I didn't trust myself to love, and I didn't trust you with the truth, Ira. I was wrong to believe that. I was wrong to push you away, to shut you out. The confession hung in the air, its weight crushing in its simplicity. Fear, cowardice, Guilt. Mako had lived with these truths, and yet he had never once given her a chance to share the burden. The tears didn't come. They wouldn't. She had cried enough for a lifetime. This was something else, a quiet kind of anger, mixed with an ache that she didn't know how to describe. He had been wrong about everything. Ira's fingers tightened around the paper as she read the final lines. She could feel the weight of every word, the admission of a man who had spent his entire life holding back from something he couldn't quite understand. I thought love made me weak, Ira. I thought it would tear me apart, expose me for who I really was. I thought if I allowed myself to love, I would lose everything. My power, my control. But the truth is, it was my fear that made me weak. Fear that made me distant, cold, unreachable. Fear that turned us into strangers in the same house. The words stung with their truth. Mako had never understood love. He had mistaken vulnerability for weakness, affection for obligation. In all their years together, in all the moments she had waited for him to open up, to let her in, he had kept her at arm's length, convinced that intimacy would shatter him. But what Ira now saw was that it was his own pride that had broken him, not love. His refusal to embrace connection, his fear of trusting someone else, had ultimately left them both hollow. I built walls around us, thinking I could protect myself. But I only ended up isolating you, and in doing so, I failed you in ways I'll never be able to make up for. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for not loving you the way you deserved. Ira felt a hollow ache, the kind that settled deep in her chest. Mako had never understood her. Not really. He had assumed that by keeping her in the dark, by keeping his emotions locked away, he was protecting her. But he hadn't protected her. He had controlled her. He had never trusted her enough to share his own truth. Instead, he had buried it in a letter that was only now finding its way into her hands, long after it mattered. His apology didn't feel like healing. It didn't even feel like a consolation. It was a truth too late to be useful. Ira sat in silence for a long time, the letter still resting in her hands. She didn't cry, not because she didn't feel the weight of the words, not because she didn't feel the sting of everything Mako had kept from her. It was because, in that moment, she realized she didn't need to cry anymore. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, they had all been there. She had carried them for years, letting them build up until they consumed her. But now, as she read Mako's final confession, the truth settled into her. He had been wrong, and that was something she couldn't change. He had kept her at a distance, built walls between them, kept her in a box that never allowed her to be seen for who she truly was. But she had seen through the facade. And that was enough. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need any more validation from the man who had defined her for so long. The years spent waiting for him to love her, the way she deserved, had been wasted. But now, she understood the truth. She had never been the one who failed. It was always him. Ira took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs. She wasn't angry. She wasn't devastated. She was just done. Done with the past. Done with the silence that had drowned her for so long. Mako's words, his confession, his guilt, they were his, not hers. She had carried his absence for far too long, but now she was ready to set it down. Ira closed her eyes for a moment, holding on to the peace that washed over her. She had spent enough time trying to rebuild a life that wasn't hers. Now, she was going to build the one that had always been waiting for her to claim it. And when she opened her eyes again, she felt a quiet kind of strength fill her chest, a strength that came from knowing that she was finally free. Mako's letter had been the final piece of the puzzle, and with it, she could finally close the door on that chapter of her life. The decision to leave the mansion was simple, almost instinctual. The place had been a symbol of Mako's control, of everything that had never been hers. It wasn't just the physical space, though the marble floors and vast rooms had always felt cold and empty. It was the memories tied to it, the ones that lingered in the walls and floors, those invisible echoes of a life that had been lived on someone else's terms. When Ira walked out the front door for the last time, she didn't look back. She had packed what little she owned into a few suitcases, leaving behind the luxury, the designer furniture, the well-placed decor. All of it had been a reflection of a life she had never truly been invited to share. She rented a small apartment in the city, in a quieter neighborhood. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a mansion. It was hers. It was a space where she could finally breathe without the weight of expectation suffocating her. The first night in the new apartment, Ira sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. The room was sparse, but she found comfort in the emptiness. This was hers to shape, to fill in any way she chose. There was no Mako here, no ghosts of what could have been, only the space for her to build something real. For the first time in a long while, Ira didn't feel like she was just passing through someone else's world. She was creating her own. The first few weeks in her new apartment were quieter than she had expected. It wasn't the silence that bothered her. In fact, it felt like a relief. It was the space, unfamiliar and open, where she could finally breathe without the pressure of expectations, without the weight of being the person everyone else wanted her to be. She began to fill her time with things that were truly hers, things she had put aside for years. She started writing again. She had always been an avid reader, and her love for storytelling had always been tucked away, a dream she'd suppressed to fit into the life Mako had built for her. But now, in the quiet solitude of her own home, she was free to explore it. She wrote short stories, snippets of her life, of her journey. It wasn't about publishing or recognition. It was about finding her voice again. Ira also began taking long walks in the park near her apartment. It became a ritual, an escape, a way to reconnect with herself. She wasn't walking to escape something. She was walking to remember who she had been before Mako. The Ira, who had dreams and hopes, who had been full of ambition before her life became consumed by someone else's. She joined a local community group that focused on helping women who had been through difficult circumstances. She hadn't realized how much she missed helping others until she was in a room full of women who, like her, had learned to survive in silence. She listened more than she spoke at first, offering her support when needed, but slowly she became part of a community that didn't require her to perform. They didn't care about the name she carried or the image she had been forced to uphold. They only cared about her heart, her experience, and her willingness to help. The more time she spent on these new activities, the more she realized how much she had been missing by staying in a life that wasn't her own. Her independence was something she had once dreamed of, but now it was something she was actively building. Each day brought her closer to the woman she had always been, before Mako, before the facade. Ira had spent years living in a bubble, shielded from the people who cared about her by the walls Mako had carefully erected around their lives. But now, with a fresh start, she began reaching out to the people she had once kept at arm's length, old friends, colleagues, even distant family members. Her first call was to Maya, an old college friend who had always been a source of laughter and light during the years when Ira had felt most invisible. Maya had always joked about Ira's perfect marriage, commenting that it was too polished to be real. They had lost touch when Ira got deeper into her marriage, and Ira knew she owed Maya an explanation, even if it was just a quick catch-up. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, Maya picked up. "Ira, is this really you?" Maya's voice was filled with disbelief, followed by a burst of laughter. "It's been too long. You sound different, though. What's going on?" Ira laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar but pleasant. "I know. Things are changing." She didn't give the full story right away, but over the course of their conversation, she opened up little by little. Maya didn't push. She simply listened, offering the same supportive, no-judgment approach she had always given. Ira realized how much she had missed that kind of support, friendship that wasn't defined by her marriage or public status. They made plans to meet for coffee the following weekend. It was a small step, but it was a reminder of how easily relationships could be rebuilt, how easily she could reconnect with the parts of herself that had been neglected. The following week, Ira also reconnected with a cousin, Lena, who had always been a steady presence in her life. Lena was the first person who truly noticed how isolated Ira had become. "You're too quiet lately," Lena had said during a call. "Let me know if you need to talk, or just be." I'm here. And Ira realized that, for the first time in years, she had the space to just be, to exist outside of the roles she had been thrust into, to redefine her relationships, to embrace the parts of herself that had been silenced by the years of Mako's control. The connections came slowly but steadily, and with each new phone call, coffee date, or evening out, Ira felt herself becoming stronger. She was learning to lean on people, to trust in the relationships that had always been there, waiting for her to find them again. Ira's life was no longer defined by what she had lost. It was defined by what she was building now. As the months passed, she realized that she had spent too long waiting for things to fall into place. Now, she was creating those pieces herself. Her daily routine was hers to shape, and each step forward felt more deliberate, more meaningful. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Her writing, which had started as a quiet hobby, began to flourish. She enrolled in a creative writing course, something she had always wanted to do but had pushed aside for years. The class didn't demand anything from her other than her creativity and her time, and for the first time in years, Ira was able to focus on herself, her passions, and her own growth. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need to prove herself to Mako, to the world, or to anyone who had judged her for the life she had once lived. Ira's writing became a way to reclaim her narrative, to tell her own story. And as she wrote, she realized something profound. The freedom she had fought for was hers. It wasn't something to be taken or given. It was something she had already created. She also started volunteering full-time at the organization she had joined, working directly with women who were finding their own paths to freedom and self-worth. Ira's work there became an extension of her own healing. It wasn't just about helping others. It was about reminding herself that she had the power to rebuild her life, just like they were rebuilding theirs. By the end of the year, Ira had a clear sense of who she was, beyond her marriage, beyond the image she had been forced to maintain. She was no longer just the wife of a powerful man. She was Ira, an independent, strong, and capable woman who had chosen herself. Her success wasn't measured in financial terms or status. It wasn't about who she knew or what doors had been opened for her. It was about choosing freedom, choosing her own happiness, and building a life on her own terms. And as she stood in front of the mirror one evening, Ira smiled, not at the reflection of a perfect woman, but at the reflection of someone who had found her peace, her strength, and her purpose. She was her own success story. Ira never imagined she would marry again. For so many years, she had built her identity around the idea of a perfect union, a life she thought would fill the empty spaces. After everything with Mako, the thought of standing before someone else, pledging her life to them, seemed almost impossible. But then came David. He was different, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet, patient way that Ira needed. David wasn't interested in her wealth, her past, or her image. He was interested in her, as she was, not as the wife of someone famous, not as the woman tied to a legacy that never felt like hers, but as the woman she had become since her divorce. David had been her friend first. They had met through mutual connections at the community center where Ira had been volunteering. It wasn't love at first sight. It was something more subtle, something that crept up quietly, like the feeling of being at home after years of wandering. Their relationship wasn't built on grand gestures. It was built on respect, trust, and shared values. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't try to make her feel like she was incomplete. With David, Ira could simply be. When he proposed, it was at the same cafe where they had shared their first long conversation. His proposal was soft, heartfelt, but it wasn't the kind of grand spectacle Ira had expected in the past. It was simple, real. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you, Ira. Will you let me?" he had asked, his hand holding hers gently, as though giving her the space to choose without pressure. And for the first time in years, Ira didn't hesitate. She said yes, not because she needed to be married, not because of any societal expectation, but because she had found someone who saw her as she was, whole, independent, and strong. It wasn't a ceremony driven by duty or tradition. It was a celebration of her choice, her freedom, her future. The wedding wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to be, Ira had spent so many years caught in a world where appearances mattered more than anything else. Her first wedding to Mako had been perfect by every measure, the kind of ceremony that the world would admire. But it wasn't her choice. It was the world's. It was Mako's. This time, there were no high-profile guests, no red carpets, no photos snapped by paparazzi. Ira didn't need any of that. The venue was small, a quiet, intimate garden, surrounded by flowers she had helped pick herself. The guest list, barely more than a handful of people. David's family, a few close friends, and, of course, Tony. The simplicity of the day was the point. It was a day defined by the choices she made, not by expectations or demands. There were no grand speeches, no shining jewelry, just a soft afternoon, the warmth of the sun kissing her skin, the comfort of having finally found her own peace. When Ira walked down the aisle, there were no tears, no dramatic pauses. She didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. The look on David's face as he waited for her at the altar wasn't one of awe. It was one of quiet, assured love. It was real. It was what she had always wanted but never received, a partnership where she was seen fully as herself. Tony stood by David's side as the best man. He wasn't just there because he was part of David's life. He was there because Ira had built a connection with him that went beyond any expectation. He didn't replace Mako. He wasn't part of the past she had walked away from. He was a child with his own journey, and she had a place in it, not as a replacement, but as someone who could offer love and understanding without conditions. The vows were simple, spoken from the heart. Ira's voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She wasn't promising to fill a role. She was promising to continue choosing herself, with David by her side. When they exchanged rings, it wasn't about ownership. It wasn't about obligation. It was about love, real and simple. Love that didn't come with conditions or expectations, but with the understanding that they both had their own individual paths, and now they had chosen to walk them together. Ira hadn't expected this moment. She hadn't planned for it. But as she stood at the entrance of the garden, the soft melody of the violin playing in the background, she realized that this moment was everything she never thought she needed. Tony, standing beside David, turned and smiled when he saw her. But he wasn't just a child at the wedding. He wasn't the child of a past that Ira had never truly been a part of. In this moment, he was the child she had grown to love, to understand. He had come to her not as someone trying to replace what was lost, but as someone who, in his own way, had helped her reclaim herself. As Ira walked toward David, her eyes caught Tony's. Without a word, he stepped forward and offered his hand. "May I?" he asked softly, his voice filled with the quiet confidence of a boy who had learned far too much about life too soon. Ira's heart swelled as she placed her hand in his. This was the moment she never thought would come, her moment where the weight of her past would be lifted, and she would be walked down the aisle not by a husband she had fought for, but by a son who had helped her find peace. Tony didn't say much as they walked together. His steps were steady, his presence calm. It wasn't a scene that required grand speeches or expressions of deep emotion. The act itself, the small gesture of walking with her, spoke louder than any words ever could. As they reached the front, where David stood waiting, Tony gave Ira's hand a final, gentle squeeze before stepping back. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, and she could see the understanding between them. He wasn't her son by blood, but in this moment he was part of her story, part of the love that had always been there, waiting for her to see it. And as Ira stood next to David, holding Tony's memory close, she felt complete. This was her family now, her choice, her future. The ceremony was quiet, intimate, and everything Ira had ever needed. The space felt full of love, but not the kind that overwhelmed or demanded attention. It was the kind of love that settled gently, like sunlight streaming through the leaves of the trees around them. Soft, warm, real. David's eyes were steady as he stood at the altar, waiting for Ira to join him. There was no anxiousness, no hurried anticipation. There was only the peace of two people choosing to be together without the weight of the past, without the baggage of expectations. Ira had thought that her wedding would be about some grand declaration, but instead, it was about the simplicity of a promise a promise to continue walking together in this life, to choose each other, not out of necessity, but because it was the right thing to do. The officiant asked the usual questions, questions that no longer felt like obligations, but rather like natural steps in a journey Ira had chosen to take. Ira, do you take David to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Ira didn't hesitate. She was already certain of her choice, her voice steady and clear as she answered, "I do." David smiled softly, his gaze unwavering. "And David, do you take Ira to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. They exchanged rings, simple bands, no extravagant designs, just symbols of the promises they had made to one another. It wasn't about the rings. It was about the meaning behind them, the strength in their simplicity. Finally, the officiant declared them husband and wife, and Ira didn't feel the rush of excitement that she had imagined. Instead, she felt a deep, calm satisfaction. This wasn't about a show for the world. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just about them, two people choosing to be together, not because they needed each other, but because they wanted to. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, Ira felt the weight of the past finally lift off her shoulders. She wasn't the woman who had once been controlled by another's expectations. She wasn't the woman who had once been erased by silence. She was Ira, choosing her future, choosing herself. And for the first time, she felt truly free. Ira stood at the edge of the cemetery, the wind cold against her skin, her footsteps soft on the gravel path. The air felt different today, quieter than it ever had before. She hadn't planned to visit Mako's grave, but something inside her had urged her to come, to face what she had avoided for so long. She approached the headstone slowly, her gaze falling on the name carved into the stone. Mako Saints, the man who had controlled her life, the man who had used silence to erase her existence. But as Ira stood there, looking at his name, she realized how small it all seemed now. The man who had once loomed so large in her life, who had been everything to her in so many ways, was now just another part of her past. And that past, full of shadows and lies, no longer had the power to define her. She knelt in front of the grave, but she didn't place flowers. She didn't need to. Flowers were for someone who had truly been mourned, someone who had left a legacy of love and truth. Mako had never left her with that. Instead, he had left her with silence, with his inability to love, and with a future she had once been too afraid to imagine. But now, she wasn't afraid anymore. Ira didn't cry. She hadn't cried for him in a long time. Instead, she simply sat in silence, the kind of silence that had once suffocated her, but now felt like freedom. She didn't need Mako's approval anymore. She didn't need to be the woman he had defined. She was her own person now, and that was enough. Ira remained kneeling at Mako's grave, her fingers brushing against the cold stone, tracing the letters of his name. She thought about all the years they had spent together, the years she had spent trying to prove her worth to him, to earn his love, to carve out a place for herself in a life that was never really hers to begin with. But today, none of that mattered. There were no tears in her eyes, no final words she needed to speak. Mako was gone, and with his death, the world she had once lived in, the one where she was invisible, erased, confined to a shadow, was gone too. She was free now, and as she sat there in silence, she realized that this was the kind of closure she had needed all along. There would be no flowers, no grand gestures, because flowers were for those who had earned their place in people's hearts, for those whose legacies were defined by love, by connection, by truth. And Mako, despite everything, had never truly earned that kind of legacy. He had built walls, hidden his truth, and in doing so, he had left Ira with nothing but silence. And so, Ira left him the same silence, the silence that had been imposed upon her for so many years. But now, that silence was hers to claim. It was no longer a prison. It was a symbol of her freedom, her strength, and the life she had finally chosen for herself. She stood slowly, taking one last glance at the grave. There was nothing left for her here, nothing but the past she had walked away from, and as she turned to leave, she felt the weight of it all finally lift. No more lies, no more waiting, no more silencing her own truth. Ira walked away, the soft rustling of the wind the only sound left behind her. As Ira walked away from the cemetery, the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. The world around her felt vast, unfamiliar yet full of possibility. There was a quiet sense of finality, as though the weight she had carried for years was slowly lifting, piece by piece. The voiceover began softly, a quiet reflection on everything Ira had experienced, on what Mako had left behind, and what Ira had learned along the way. Power dies with the man, but truth survives in what he left behind. Mako had built an empire, but it had crumbled with his death. His power, his control, his carefully curated life, gone. He had tried to shape the world around him, to craft a narrative where he held the reins. But in the end, it was his truth that remained, not the fortune, not the image he had built. The truth of who he was, of what he had hidden from Ira, and of the silence he had imposed on both of them, was what lingered. The real truth, the one Ira had fought for, had never been about the money or the inheritance. It wasn't about taking back what Mako had left behind. It was about being seen, being heard, and finally, being free. She had reclaimed herself, not by fighting for a will, but by refusing to let his control define her any longer. She had built her own truth, and it was far stronger than anything Mako could ever offer her. Ira stood in front of her new apartment, the door closed behind her, the city stretching out before her. The skyline was bathed in the orange light of dusk, a reminder of the world that had always been there, waiting for her to step into it fully. She had once been lost in the shadows of someone else's life, but now, as she looked out at the view, she realized that her story was hers to write. It had taken years for her to find the courage to walk away from the life Mako had built for her. The mansion, the fortune, the perfect image, none of it had ever truly been hers. She had spent so long trying to fit into a life that wasn't meant for her, but now she was free. Free from the lies, free from the silence. Mako's death had brought closure, but it had also shown Ira something more important. It wasn't the money, the estate, or the legacy that mattered in the end. It was how she chose to live her life, how she chose to define herself. This wasn't about the fortune, the voiceover continued, soft but powerful. It was about being seen. She wasn't a side character in someone else's story anymore. She wasn't the wife or the image that had been projected for years. She was Ira, whole, independent, and unafraid to stand on her own. Her journey hadn't been about fighting for what Mako had left behind. It had been about finding her own truth, the truth that had always been there, waiting to be claimed. As she stood in the quiet of the evening, she didn't feel sadness or loss. She felt peace. She had chosen this life, and for the first time, she felt truly seen, not by Mako, not by anyone else, but by herself. So I want you to know that life can be full of challenges, of moments when we feel erased, unseen, or forgotten. But let me remind you today, your story is far from over. Every hardship you face, every door that closes, is simply the universe making space for you to become who you were always meant to be. No one else defines your worth. You don't need permission to be yourself. You don't need validation from others to shine. Like Ira, you can stand tall in your truth, no matter how much silence has tried to hold you down. Your story is yours to tell, and you are worthy of the peace, the love, and the success that is already on its way. Remember this, dignity is not given to you, it is claimed. You claim it by choosing yourself, by living your truth, by choosing to believe in your own strength, no matter how the world may try to silence you. No matter what you've faced, no matter what has been taken, you are more than enough. And the world is waiting to see you rise to the heights you are destined for. Heavenly Father, we come before you today with hearts full of gratitude and hope. We thank you for the strength you have given us to rise above every challenge, to overcome every obstacle, and to choose ourselves when the world tries to define us. Lord, you know the pain we've carried, the silence we've endured, and the fear we've faced. But we know that through you, we find peace. Through you, we find strength. Through you, we reclaim our dignity. We ask that you guide us as we walk into the future you have planned for us. May we never forget that we are your children, worthy of love, worthy of respect, and worthy of happiness. Help us to keep our hearts open, to forgive what we cannot change, and to embrace the blessings you have set before us. May our journey be filled with clarity, peace, and joy, knowing that we are always seen and always loved by you. And may we, like Era, rise above the lies, the pain, and the hurt, and step boldly into the life you have created for us. In your precious name we pray, Amen. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, your worth is limitless, and your potential is endless. Keep moving forward with faith, courage, and love. Have you ever had to reclaim your worth after being erased? If Era's story resonated with you, leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Your story matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this journey with someone who needs to hear it.